Welcome to a new episode of Deccan Dialogues. Today we have a very interesting guest who will throw light on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Mr. Venkatesh Varma, who was till recently India's ambassador to Moscow and is a specialist on Russian affairs. In conversation with him is Mohan Guruswamy, economist and commentator on current affairs. They will cover a whole range of topics, from what are the historical facts that led to this conflict? What role has the Western world, including the USA, played in this conflict? And as G20 president, how can India help to facilitate talks? This and much more in today's conversation. Over to Mohan Guruswamy and Venkatesh Varma.
So, nice to see you again. I'm seeing you, after 87? 88 in Moscow?
89, 90.
89, 90 in Moscow. I remember those days there was nothing in Moscow. But nobody predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union so soon, yes. Even though all the signs were there. People were afraid to say that the superpower is collapsing.
Yeah, there were tumultuous times.
Yeah, tumultuous times.
But you came at a very interesting time.
I came at a very interesting time. Second time I was there a week before the attempted coup. Then I came after the coup. Then several times after that.
Yeah. People say that in Russia nothing changes for 200 years. But sometimes more change comes about in 20 years.
Absolutely. It's incredible. You know, one can't conceive of world affairs without a Soviet Union.
Indeed.
You know, and it's 30 years now, it's all gone.
Yes.
And this new Russia is very different.
Very different.
Very different. So, I was, very fascinated by how the old Russia and the new Russia, the old Soviet Union, were equally hard states. You know, after the collapse of the Soviet Union,
yeah,
you had a whole bunch of former security people in different occupations, but you always felt that they were running the same thing the same way, because when you came to the airport and when you started traveling inside, you always felt that people were keeping a good eye on you. And then, you know, I've been to the air show a few times, and I've been to Vladivostok once later. But Russian military power seems so, except for a few years, seemed to be bounding back in the, particularly after the 2000s, 2004, 2005. Putin announced a lot of new weaponry, all that. I wonder what happened to all that modernization and, you know, new developments in this war. I frankly thought this war would last for about a few months at the most. But it's almost a year now.
Well, the nature of the Russian state is quite fascinating. It's the largest country in the world. And you can't keep a country as large as Russia together if you don't have a national security elite that is dedicated to its protection. You know, one of the primary purposes of the national security elite is towards territorial preservation. And Russia has evolved over 300 to 300 years. And it's an extended territory. Sometimes people call it the last of the colonial empires. Of course, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the colonial nature of the empire became much less, because many of the peripheral republics became independent. And Russia, for the first 2 decades, accepted that independence. But in Ukraine, I think the Ukrainian independence sovereignty went to the other extreme, where Ukraine thought that it would protect its interests through inviting distant protectors for its proximate security interests. And there was definitely a red line that was crossed for Ukraine. And Russia felt it had no option but to undertake this military operation. Of course, it is a military invasion of Ukraine, but the history goes back almost 20-30 years, when Russian weakness attracted NATO expansion. And Russia had to draw a line at some stage.
For a while, yes.
Yeah. The Russian military, interesting organization to watch. Russian military service is always, in Russian society, a very respected profession. as part of the elite conception. Except for the Soviet period, where the Communist Party put huge restrictions on the Soviet military. It is, like communist parties do. I mean, even in China, the PLA is under very strict control of the party. The army has come into its own in the last 20 years. Putin has presided over a very large militarization. Mm-hmm. But I think, to your question, why the war has lasted so long, I guess the Russians themselves didn't anticipate that the war would... the Russians anticipated definitely that Ukraine was a very formidable military power because of the assistance that it was getting from the West even before the invasion.
Yeah, during that Orange Revolution time.
Indeed. So from 2014 onwards, especially after 2016, about almost 80,000 Ukrainian troops were organized into very specialized battalions, which had come up to NATO standards. And the countries that had supported it are the United States, UK, Canada, Poland. So Ukraine had not been admitted as a member of NATO, but many of its armed force units had come up to NATO standards. Mm-hmm. So for Russia, the choice was to wait longer and to see whether the Minsk agreements that had been concluded in 2015 would be able to solve the problem. Because Russian minorities in southern and eastern Ukraine were definitely being marginalized. Because I think they were seen as the Trojan horse for Russia, number one. And there was instances of extreme Ukrainian nationalism.
Absolutely. You know, the voting trends very clearly indicate that the East was always voting for pro-Russian parties and the Western part was pulling in a different direction. But it's amazing how we in India didn't seem to observe this as a critical thing which could change, Russian policies very suddenly. Crimea was very clear that it was going to happen. And when it happened, I personally had been writing for a few weeks or a few months before that this is a natural part of Russia and the civil war was going on and it will not go on like this, with the Ukrainians pounding the Russian ethnic population, even though they were being armed by Russia, and without being answered. But what was amazing is how it turned out into an unity between the Russian-speaking areas and the Russian homeland, into invasion of Ukraine. That is one thing which the other fascinating thing is that both of them are so similar in terms of history. And after Ukraine is the heart of Russia, the Kievan Rus was there. And it's like, I was telling somebody the difference between UP and Bihar.
Absolutely.
Same kind of history, same kind of language. I think there's 95% similarity in the language also.
Yeah, exactly.
So this fight therefore looks almost even more tragic. But I went to a couple of EU conferences in the last decade or so. I used to be amazed at the kind of hostility the new Europe used to have. All these guys, Poland, Romania, Hungary, all these delegates from these countries, how hostile they were towards Russia. And as if they were wanting NATO to surround Russia.
You see, history is always in operation amongst big powers, and I'm sure it applies to India as well. India quickly, we have had the division of the Indus river system. Mm. It goes against the grain of history. It is temporary in historical terms. In political terms, of course, it's permanent in terms of India and Pakistan. But similarly, with respect to Russia, Russia would be a small principality, an extended principality of Moscow, if Russia did not have access to the Baltic Sea, and Russia did not have access to the Black Sea. And access to the Black Sea, Crimea is absolutely critical. I mean, it's inconceivable for Russia to be a Black Sea power without Crimea. So when Crimea was lost to Ukraine as part of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, one maritime limb of Russia was was in a sense severed. Now Russia was willing to live with that, provided the Ukrainians also had good neighborly relations with Russia.
Not hostile.
Yes. But if they went to the other extreme, and they were open to establishment of Western naval bases in the Black Sea area, and also giving more and more space for Turkey to come back, and because Turkey was once upon a time a preeminent power in the Black Sea area.
And Russia's traditional foe.
Indeed. So these circumstances, I think, were quite compelling. So analysts always make the mistake that countries go to war only when they are assured of a victory. More often than not, countries go to war to prevent this bad situation from getting worse.
And the thing which many of us even now tend to forget is that Crimea was a part of Russia till 1954.
Indeed.
Till in the reorganization, Khrushchev,
yes,
who was himself a bit of an Ukrainian, having lived all his life in Ukraine,
yes,
passed it back to Ukraine and said, this is a natural geographical adage to you.
And you made a very apt comment on the intertwined nature of the Russian and Ukrainian people. You know, they're both Slavic. They have been adjacent or cohabiting people for 1,000 years. A very strong close religious roots. They're not exactly the same religion, because the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine is slightly different from. But those divisions were never of the nature that would create such animosity. What has created this extremely bitter and sharp animosity is not racism, because they are both the same race. It's not economic deprivation. It is, Ukraine cannot say it's been a colony of Russia. Russia and Ukraine, everything that was built in Ukraine today existed because of Soviet labor.
Absolutely.
I mean, it was if Mariupol had one of the largest steel plants in the world, it was because the Soviets had built it. If there was, the largest nuclear plant in Europe is in Zaporozhye. It was built by Soviet engineers. So, but I think it's a apt comment to see that when very closely intertwined people get caught up in large geopolitical conflict, the conflict tends to get very, very sharp. And I think that sharpness is now witnessed.
Now.
Yes.
American political scientists, some of them have been commenting for some time now, you don't play around with Ukraine. Ukraine naturally belongs to Russia. People like Mearsheimer, people like even Kissinger.
Indeed.
Said that. But there's some drive within in the US which has pushed them towards this also, which kept egging it on, playing this game, overthrowing the Yanukovych government and all that. But didn't they anticipate that Russia will retaliate or strike back?
That's a good question, because I think it goes to the heart of grand strategy and decision making amongst the big powers. I think American attitude towards Russia was in a sense frozen in the 1990s. The 1990s Russia was a Russia that the United States adored. Weak, docile, had completely lost its soul, very pro-Western, very pro-capitalist, very pro-free market, and willing to play a supplicant's role in the larger international game. So therefore, NATO expansion, the 5 waves of it, was conceived in this notion that Russia was weak. And the question was often asked in Washington, why do we have to compromise with Russia when indeed we have won the Cold War?
Absolutely.
So it was framed in those rather absolute terms. Now that was true for a while. In fact, Russia was not strong enough. In fact, it was very weak to protest against the first, second, third, and in fact, fourth and fifth stages of NATO expansion. But NATO expansion was a successful political diplomatic strategy only until the point that the Russians reacted with force. And the Russians reacted with marginal force during the 2008 Georgia problem. 2007, you remember, President Putin went to the Munich conference and very clearly drew a red line saying that NATO expansion was not acceptable to, but nobody took him seriously. Now, I think the 2014 events clearly turned the tide, where it was the lessons drawn in Washington were diametrically opposite to what the lessons that were drawn in Moscow. The lessons drawn in Washington was that the 2014 Maidan events in February was the turning point of Russian influence in Ukraine, and Russian influence could be sort of expelled from Ukraine physically. Russia took the opposite lesson, that Russia had to build up its strength, and a military conflict with Ukraine was inevitable. But Russia was prepared in 2015 to go down a modus vivendi, a compromise, so to speak, where if autonomy was given to the Russian-speaking regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, Russia was willing to give additional guarantees for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of. Now, Chancellor Merkel's interview just recently, which you would have seen, clearly states that that was a ruse on part of the West. Ukraine wanted more time to rearm with Western assistance, and it was always the intention to, in a sense, put uniformity into Ukraine at the expense of Russia, where Ukrainian nationalism, extreme right-wing nationalism was also. Now, the first miscalculation of the Russians was that a quick military campaign would topple the Ukrainian military. That didn't happen, because not only the Ukrainians fought very well, very bravely, but they also got unprecedented, never in history as a set of countries given so much assistance in such short period of time, including if you add the 45 billion, 50 billion that was promised to Zelensky, President Zelensky just this week during his visit to Washington. So the overall, in 8 months, the United States has provided over $100 billion. Never in history has it happened. It's not happened for Israel. It's not happened for Egypt. It's not happened even during the quantum of assistance. Has not happened even during the Lend-Lease assistance during the Cold War period. So it's quite unprecedented. The calculation on part of the West was that this very strong economic sanctions that they would impose on Russia would lead to a collapse of the Russian political economy, would change the political calculus in which President Putin was making his calculations about war and peace. And Russia would, in a sense, sue for peace because it would be on its knees. Exactly the opposite has happened. Now, what has kicked in is, I think the Russians did make a number of mistakes in the first and second campaign season campaigns, but I think now they are got down to a grind. There is a very strong strategic determination combined with strategic patience. So they are grinding the Ukrainian military to the ground, and at some stage the power differential between Russia and Ukraine will kick in, and there will be a military stalemate, but with Russia gaining the upper hand. And that is when some sort of window will open for some sort of a peace settlement.
And a drawing of a new border or a line of control,
yes.
You can call it.
And the new border will be determined by military success on the ground and defensible borders, because
and ethnicities inside.
Indeed.
Yeah, true. But you know, the interesting thing about Russia is that India was one of the few countries which first came out and said, okay, we will continue to buy Russian oil. I think that was a very sagacious move on part of India. I was a little surprised. I thought, we will succumb to Western pressure. But there was a mood in Delhi in the early 2000s that Russia is finished, and there was a lot of hostility towards Russia, not only in the MEA, but also in the armed forces. Because I used to sense that when I used to talk to people and all that. And I wrote a paper in 2004, I think, or 3, the Russians are coming, as to how this economy was bouncing back. I'd been there a couple of times, one on a government junket also to study what's happening. And I wrote papers which were circulated to the government. And but nobody seemed to have taken Russian, the armed forces particularly, just didn't want to look at Russian aircraft anymore. And I used to tell them that if you allow the Soviet aviation industry to be destroyed, then you will be entirely at the mercy of Western aviation. And these planes which you're paying 200 million, they start costing you 1,000 million. Because they will have a monopoly between two companies, two engine makers. And this is your hedge again, and that you could cooperate. So, and I was quite surprised when the fifth generation was cancelled. You could make out from, as an outsider, I could sense that the IAF was just not keen at all. They just wanted out of it. Even the modernization of the Sukhois, you could see a tendency to drag the feet along here, even getting new missiles for the planes, which only after we did badly at Balakot, that the urgency came back, that we have to get more missiles from Russia. But have we now done the right thing by straightening our bets and saying that, okay, we are not against Russia, but we'll continue to act in our own interests?
No, I think the government approach to the Russia-Ukraine conflict has been one of caution and one of prudence, rooted in our own interests and our own analysis of the situation. In terms of use of force against another country in violation of sovereignty and territorial integrity, obviously we are very uncomfortable with it. It is the red line that Russia has crossed. But surely the framing of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, India has clearly not accepted how the conflict has been framed in the West.
Absolutely.
That is, we have not said so publicly, but I think the clear message is this notion that it is a fight between democracy and autocracy, and it is only Russia which is to blame, and Ukraine is a pure victim and Russia is the pure aggressor. I think that notion, India, I think, was one of the first big countries to have questioned that in terms of its votes, its abstentions in the Security Council, and also its explanations of its national position. So there was no clear endorsement of that. But I think India's lead in that of studying the situation as it is, which is that it is a European war, unfortunate as it is, a collapse of European security, in which the developing world is a bystander, but a bystander which is being asked to pay an extraordinarily heavy price for a conflict that they are unrelated to. I think this levels, this type of analysis, I think, is caught on in the Global South. And the Global South, I think, has deep skepticism of the Western framing of the conflict. Now, with respect to our armed forces and Russia, we've been through these phases back and forth over 50, 60 years. The first agreement we signed for a Make in India program was on August 29th, 1961, 62 actually, when we signed the thing for the manufacture of the MiG-21 aircraft in Nashik. We signed that agreement after our Ministry of Defense and our Air Force had failed in securing a good jet fighter aircraft for the Indian Air Force.
Absolutely.
For 4 years.
Indian Air Force wanted the Lightning, the British said no, you don't need it.
We went begging to London, to Paris and to Washington.
Absolutely.
And in all three capitals, they were willing to offer us jets that were of the late 40s, early 50s vintage. It is just the Soviets who came up, and possibly for their own reasons, but the fact is that they were willing to give this with joint manufacture in India. I agree with you on the fifth generation aircraft. I think our services need to change their paradigm of decision making, because it is well understood that each service would want to see how they have available with them in a quick time frame the best aircraft available, and that's a natural requirement, and that is something that the country and the government should fulfill. But the services also have an obligation to see that their procurement decisions and their aircraft decisions should be linked also how the technological base of the country will improve.
And dovetails with the country's
Indeed.
own interests. You know?
So the Russians were prepared to co-develop the 5th generation aircraft with us. It was expensive by any measure. I would agree with that. But expense is not the only issue on which because now we don't have a 5th generation aircraft on the board. I mean, it's
we will not get one.
Yeah, there is some attempt at local development, but I think local development would have been accelerated if we had a code development program.
Absolutely.
And that can apply to several other things. I think the mistake that our some strategic analysts make about Russia is, Russia, I think, is never as weak as it seems to be. And Russia may not be as strong as it is made out to be sometimes by themselves. But I think Russia is never as weak as it should be. And a multipolar world means a multipolar procurement industry.
Absolutely.
Because if you are at the mercy of one or two suppliers, you would tend to be, taken for a ride on pricing, on technology, on restrictions on use.
Even the MiG-21, much was made out in this country about attrition rates. But if you look at any equivalent Western aircraft, whether if it is the F-104 or whatever, the attrition rates are higher. I mean, those series have completely collapsed. They disappeared. Whereas the 16,000 MiG-21s were made. And even on the Sukhoi, there was much talk about, failure rates. But if you looked at the data of Russian operations in Syria, and the failure rate in Syria in combat duty, it's far less than what we have. We have problems. We really need to look at how some things work in hell, rather than keep saying the aircraft is bad. We've had similar problems with the only aircraft which seem to be doing well in India are the ones which come fully made. As soon as we start assembling them or doing things, we seem to have different kinds of attrition rates. There's something we need to set right in HAL, rather than blame the Russians. The difference in price, say, Parikar himself said that the difference in price between the Sukhoi 30 and the Rafale or whatever was 1:3. He said, can we afford it? We are banding around 36 Rafales, and that's not going to deter the Chinese. You need to have 6-8 squadrons of aircraft which can deal with the Chinese. And the Sukhoi 30 or Sukhoi 35 could have fitted the bill. We make the engine here, we have the airframe here. The technology is invested. Now that technology goes. We're getting a new technology. So whether we really work these things through and whether our political leadership thinks strategically that this is the way we should go in the long run.
I think the present political leadership, I think Prime Minister Modi's emphasis on Make in India, I think is a seminal turn in our approach to defense production. This government, I think, is serious. Indigenization and local defense production doesn't mean that we will not cooperate with foreign vendors. True. But I think the emphasis should be on technology transfer, local co-development and local production. And in technology transfer, the country which is most willing to do that for India is Russia.
Absolutely.
Even now.
Even with all the troubles.
Yeah.
But that all now depends on where we will go, depends on how this war is going to stalemate or end. Either the ceasefire and the talks. Why isn't India, which is kind of midway placed with both countries, initiating a leadership in this? America can't talk to them, the West can't talk to them. China will not talk because it's too closely aligned with Russia and it's too hostile to America. So India having a central role, why don't we start picking up threads and try to intervene between these two countries and make them sit in one place?
Well, in a sense, India is already positioning itself rather well. Very fact that we didn't take sides in the Security Council rather than closing our options, actually has opened up our diplomatic options. And both sides, I think, the oil, fertilizer, coking coal purchases that we're doing with Russia are hugely beneficial for us. Secondly, I think our stance in favor of peace, right from the beginning, and Prime Minister Modi has said that, repeatedly, I think has really created a credibility strength for us, because even today, the West, and what President Biden told Zelensky yesterday, that they will support them in the war as long as it takes. So there is no peace. I
was looking at those figures, what is going to buy what. And all I see in that is a huge pump prime of the American military-industrial complex.
Yes, I mean, they are the greatest beneficiaries of the greatest beneficiaries of the war. So until that hunger plateaus out, the prospects for peace in Russia-Ukraine conflict are less. However, India will be chairing the G20 for this year.
That's right.
So that, I think, will offer opportunities for India to play a more active role. I think India is positioning itself for a more active role. Whether the opportunity actually turns to give change the role of India from a peace seeker to a peacemaker, we'll wait and see how the war actually turns out.
Final point is there a conditioning within India, within the establishment, the bureaucratic establishment, the political establishment, the media, which sees, which is equidistant, like it used to be before between Russia and the West? Or is it now we're pulling westward? As you can see, it seems to be fairly apparent in media discussions and how we've covered the Ukrainian side of the conflict in our media.
I think our media's coverage of the Ukraine war is a very sad story. If you open the 5 main English newspapers in our country, which publish every day, all 5 of them carry reports of 3 big Western news agencies. Yeah. Reuters, AFP, and that's it. And in that sense, on a very major international development, our international window is one of a supplicant. We are almost like an information colony of the West. But it is surprising, and some of it is spilled over into the TV and social media as well. But it is surprising how the elite and people of India generally have a well-laid skepticism of the Western narrative. So there was a recent poll that was done about, I think, 6 weeks ago, which said, who do you blame for the current conflict in Ukraine? It was a global poll. In the West, in Europe and America, more than 80% said Russia was the reason for the Russia-Ukraine conflict. In India, it was just 29%. So despite this very strong media barrage, I mean, we are actually victims of the media war that is being fought globally. Even then, there is deep skepticism of...
Ukrainian ambassador in Delhi, he was sending journalists to Ukraine,
Indeed.
TV.
But it has not worked. It has not worked.
Well, I hope so.
It has not worked, and I think there is always inherently an innate sympathy for Russia.
That has been a traditional friend.
Oh, yes. So that kicks in. I think there is disquiet about the war and the tragedy it is creating for people on both sides of the conflict. But the fact is that if it were come to choosing one side, I think Indian public sentiment is in favor of Russia.
Good. Let's end this discussion on that note. Hopeful, and hope that India will have a role to play in bringing this, that is the hot part of this conflict, to an end.
Yes, I hope so too. And thank you for the opportunity to speak. Thank you.